On Thanksgiving, the doorbell rang. It was a homeless man. "Do you have any spare food?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. My mom, already standing by the door with the bowl of mashed potatoes in hand, looked him up and down, her face tightened. She hesitated only a moment before replying. "Give him money and close the door," she said, but then my dad spoke, his voice louder than I expected. "Set another place. He's eating with us." The words hit me like a slap in the face. I could feel my pulse quicken. My eyes darted between the man standing outside and my dad's face, which was strangely unreadable. My mom's expression flickered between annoyance and something else, something deeper that I couldn't quite place. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here we were, in the middle of our Thanksgiving dinner, and my dad wanted to invite a complete stranger into our home. Fury bubbled up inside me, making my throat tighten. I couldn't stand the thought of this man sitting at our table, spoiling what was supposed to be a special day. I had plans to enjoy a peaceful meal with my family, to talk about everything and nothing, to enjoy the comfort of tradition. But now this homeless man was going to ruin it. My mom turned toward me, her eyes pleading as she motioned for me to calm down. "It's just one meal, Adam. Let's be kind." I didn't answer her. I couldn't. Instead, I turned on my heel and stormed out of the room, not even waiting to see if they'd actually follow through with it. But, of course, they did. The table was rearranged. My dad set out an extra chair. I could hear him calling out to the man, inviting him in. "Come on in. Dinner's ready," he said. His voice was warm, welcoming even. I wanted to shout, to yell at my dad for making such an absurd decision. But I couldn't. It wasn't my place, not tonight. So, I bit my tongue, tried to swallow the rising anger, and stood off to the side watching. When the man stepped inside, he was exactly what I expected: ragged clothes, dirt-streaked skin, eyes that seemed tired in a way that I couldn't quite understand. His presence in the house was jarring. A stranger, a man with no connection to us, standing among us like he belonged. And he didn't, not in my eyes. Dinner started with an uncomfortable silence. Everyone was careful, unsure of how to behave. My dad was unusually cheerful, asking James, this man who had a name now, though it meant nothing to me, about his life. My mom, ever the hostess, tried to make small talk, offering him more mashed potatoes, more turkey, though I could see the discomfort in her eyes, too. But it wasn't just the awkwardness that made me feel uneasy. It was something else, something that lingered in the air, thick and charged. And then, just when I thought the evening might settle into a strange but manageable rhythm. At dinner, James said something that made my dad go white. His face drained of color, and for a moment, I thought he might pass out right there at the table. He didn't say a word in response, but his eyes. They were wide, locked on James with a look of pure shock. For the first time all evening, he looked terrified. I stared at them both, unable to process what was happening. What had this man said? What did he know about my dad that had caused such a reaction? And that's when I realized I had no idea who this man really was. The air in the room felt thick, like the moment before a storm. Everyone shifted in their chairs, unsure of what to do next. James, the homeless man, sat across from me, his hands folded neatly in his lap, a slight but steady tremor running through his fingers. He looked so out of place at our Thanksgiving table, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. But still, my dad had insisted, so there he was, taking a place at our table as though he belonged. I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort, the strange pull in my chest. My dad had never been one to make hasty decisions. He usually thought things through, calculate every move, every word. But this had been reckless. And what really bothered me was the way he kept looking at James, like he recognized him, but couldn't place where from. The moment James had walked in, my dad had gone stiff. He'd smile, of course, that same polite, forced smile he always wore when meeting new people, but his eyes had betrayed him. I caught a glimpse of something raw. Fear, maybe. I couldn't quite understand why he was acting this way. Across the table, my mom smiled politely, trying to keep the conversation light. She offered James more food, asking if he wanted more turkey, more stuffing. Her hands moved quickly, almost nervously, as she refilled his plate, her gaze flickering to my dad every so often, like she was checking to see if everything was okay. But it wasn't. I could feel it. The tension in the air was palpable, suffocating. I tried to ignore it, but my thoughts kept returning to the same question: who was this man? How did he know my father? James didn't help matters by speaking in cryptic phrases. "I remember this house," he said, his voice low, but clear. "The garden, the driveway. Used to be a lot more trees in the yard." He looked out the window, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's funny how places change." I didn't know what to make of it. Did he know the house from years ago? Was he just speaking to fill the silence, or did he know something that none of us were privy to? The way he said it, though, it didn't sound like a random observation. It sounded like he had memories, real memories, tied to this place. My dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He cleared his throat, and set his glass of water down a little too hard, the sound of it hitting the table louder than necessary. He glanced at my mom quickly, but she didn't seem to notice. She was too busy chatting with James, asking him about his life, where he'd been, how he ended up on the streets. I could tell she was trying to make him feel comfortable, but she was also trying to mask the discomfort in the room. Used to be a lot more trees, huh? I said, trying to cut through the awkwardness. What do you mean by that? I didn't expect a response, but I had to ask. It was nagging at me, this strange familiarity he had with the place. James turned his gaze slowly toward me, those tired, gray eyes locking with mine. You're his son, aren't you? He asked, his voice steady. You look just like him. My dad froze at that, his hand hovering just above his plate. My mom glanced at him, her expression unreadable. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. My father. The man I had always looked up to, the one who had taught me everything about what it meant to be strong, was suddenly sitting at the table, trapped in a moment of discomfort that I couldn't explain. Wes, I'm Adam, I said, trying to keep my voice casual though inside everything was unraveling. And you are? James, he replied simply. But you can call me Jim. His smile was small, almost sad, as if there was some deeper understanding between us that I wasn't yet privy to. A strange silence settled over the table. My dad, who had been so careful with his words before, didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply stared at James, his expression tightening, but not in a way that made sense. It wasn't anger, it was something else. It was fear. I tried to push down the growing sense of unease that had taken root in me. It wasn't just the strange familiarity that James had with the house. It was the way my dad had reacted when he'd spoken. It was like he knew this man, but didn't want me or anyone else to know that he did. I didn't know what to think. The man sitting at our table, eating the food we'd prepared, was someone I had never met before. Yet, somehow, he seemed to know us all. My father, especially. And that thought alone made the air in the room feel even heavier. As dinner wore on, the silence between us grew. I could barely focus on my food, distracted by the questions piling up in my head. Why was this man here? What did he know about my dad? Why had he been invited to sit at our table? The questions swirled in my mind like a storm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that none of us were saying aloud. And then, without warning, James spoke again, his voice breaking through the tension. I remember your father. Back when he used to work in real estate. He was always so good with numbers. My stomach dropped. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad's face went pale, his eyes wide, as if he'd heard something he wasn't prepared for. For the first time all night, he looked like he might say something, but no words came out. It was in that moment that I realized. James wasn't just a homeless man. He wasn't just a stranger at our table. He was someone from my father's past, someone with a story that was about to come crashing into the present. And I had no idea what that story was. The conversation around the table had quieted down significantly after James's mention of my father's past in real estate. My mom, trying to keep things normal, offered more food to everyone, her voice forced in its cheerfulness. But my mind was reeling. James had just dropped a bombshell. My dad had been involved in real estate. That was news to me. He had always made it seem like his business ventures were a matter of pride, something solid, unshakable, built from nothing. But now, sitting across from a homeless man, I began to question everything I thought I knew about my family's history. James sat there, eating his food slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if he wasn't bothered by the heavy silence hanging over the table. He didn't look nervous, like most people would in this situation. He didn't even seem grateful, though my mom had gone out of her way to make sure he felt comfortable. Instead, he seemed distant, as if he were a spectator in our lives, just passing through. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. James wasn't just a random homeless man who happened to knock on our door. There was a connection here, something between him and my father that neither of them was willing to talk about. My father had made it clear that he didn't want to revisit the past. But why? What had happened back then? I shifted in my seat, trying to focus on my meal, but I couldn't stop my mind from racing. I stole glances at my dad, whose face was unusually pale and his movements stiff. He had been so relaxed before, but now he was on edge. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked to James, and I could tell he was trying to figure out how much to reveal, or how little. My mom, ever the mediator, kept the conversation going, asking James more questions about his life. His story. But every answer he gave seemed to only raise more questions for me. He spoke about his childhood in a small town, about how he'd once had a family of his own. But when my mom asked him what had gone wrong, he fell silent for a long time. Finally he muttered, "People change, you know. The world changes. And sometimes it takes losing everything to see things clearly." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. I wasn't sure if he was speaking about himself or someone else. Maybe it was his way of making sense of his current situation, or maybe he was speaking directly to my father. After all, it seemed like my dad had been the one to bring James to this point. That was the only thing that made sense to me. The more I watched James, the more I noticed the subtle way he was studying my father. There was a familiarity in his gaze, an understanding between them that went beyond what I could comprehend. It was like they were playing a game that I wasn't part of. And I hated that feeling. It was like the floor was slowly slipping out from under me, and I couldn't catch my balance. James must have felt my eyes on him, because he suddenly turned his head and met my gaze. He didn't smile or look away, he just looked at me, those gray eyes of his sharp and knowing. "You're a good kid," he said softly. "You've got a lot of your father in you." The words took me by surprise, and I couldn't figure out if he was complimenting me or mocking me. Either way, it sent a chill down my spine. My dad, who had been so silent for the past few minutes, finally broke his stare from James and turned toward me. His face was drawn tight, but he managed to force a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't mind him," my dad said, his voice too casual. "James, he's just reminiscing." Nothing more. But his words didn't match his expression. There was something he wasn't telling me, and the longer James sat there, the more I felt the walls of my life begin to crack open. As the evening dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that James wasn't just some random person in our home. He was here for a reason. His calm demeanor, the way he seemed to know so much about my father without even asking the right questions, everything about him felt deliberate. It felt like he had been waiting for this moment. When the meal was finished, and the table was cleared, James lingered at the edge of the room, his presence still heavy in the air. My mom busied herself with the dishes, and my dad, still unnervingly quiet, disappeared into the study, leaving me alone in the living room with James. The sound of silverware clinking against porcelain echoed from the kitchen, but there was a silence between us now, a weight that hadn't been there earlier. James leaned back in his chair, looking around the room, almost as if he were inspecting it. "This place. It's a lot different now," he murmured. "But it still feels like home." I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened, and I simply nodded. His words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't grasp their meaning. There was something so familiar, yet so foreign about everything he said. I wanted to ask more, to demand answers. Who was this man? How did he know so much? But my mind kept coming back to my father, who hadn't said a word since James mentioned his past. I knew then that I couldn't let it go. Whatever this man knew, whatever he wanted, I was going to find out. I had to. Dinner ended in a haze of discomfort, the clinking of plates and silverware masking the underlying tension in the room. My mom, as always, busied herself with cleaning up, her movements quick and precise, though her eyes kept darting over to my dad. She was clearly trying to avoid any confrontation, but I could tell it was eating at her too. My dad, who had been silent ever since James dropped that bombshell, finally excused himself, mumbling something about checking on work emails. He was moving in a way that wasn't like him, slower, almost reluctant. I caught a glimpse of him looking at James once more, his expression a mixture of fear and regret. That look haunted me. What was it about this man that had caused him to react like that? I wanted to go after him, to demand answers, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there in the living room, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thick, like something heavy was about to fall. James had barely moved since the meal ended. He was still sitting at the table, his back slightly hunched, staring down at his hands as though lost in thought. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over to him, my footsteps almost too loud in the silence. He didn't look up as I approached. I stood in front of him, watching him for a few moments, trying to figure out how to start. There was so much I wanted to ask. But I had to pick the right question, the one that would finally break the ice and get to the truth. "You knew my dad, didn't you?" I asked. My voice felt sharp, more confrontational than I'd meant, but it was too late to take it back now. James didn't look up immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, almost as if savoring the moment. When he did look up, there was something in his gaze, something calculating. He wasn't afraid of me. "Anyone, yes," he said, his voice calm. I knew him a long time ago. That response didn't sit well with me, was so vague, so distant. What did a long time ago even mean? Years? Decades? I needed more. "Where are you here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel my frustration bubbling to the surface. Why show up now, after all these years? What do you want from him? James's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "What do I want?" he repeated, his voice low. "I don't want anything from him, Adam. But you need to understand something first." He paused, and I felt my stomach tighten. What was he getting at? "Your father," James continued, his eyes narrowing. "He's not the man you think he is. He's not the man you've believed him to be all these years." I didn't know how to respond to that. Was he trying to unsettle me? Did he think I didn't already have doubts about my father? Because I did. The more I thought about everything, about the way my dad had acted when James arrived, the way he had reacted to certain things, the more I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, James was right, but I couldn't let myself believe that yet. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, shaking my head. "My dad's always been. He's always been there for me. He's never done anything to make me doubt him." James raised an eyebrow, almost like he was amused by my response. "No, Adam," he said, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't expected. "You've only ever seen one side of him. You don't know the whole story, and you're about to find out." That was the moment I realized I couldn't walk away from this. Whatever had happened between my father and James, whatever secrets he was hiding, it was all about to come to light. I didn't know how, or when, but I knew one thing for sure: I needed to know the truth. I had to. Why don't you just tell me? I pressed, my voice thick with the anger that had been building inside me. Why don't you just tell me what you know about my dad? James leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He didn't seem bothered by my anger at all. Your father made some choices, he said, his voice low, almost mournful. Choices that changed both of our lives. I felt the floor shift beneath me. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to hear what James was about to say. But there was no turning back now. Not after everything I'd already heard. I'm not here for revenge. James continued, his tone softer now, like he was explaining something to a child. I'm here because you deserve to know the truth, Adam. You deserve to know who your father really is. I could feel my heart racing. It was as though the entire world had just shifted, tilting on its axis. I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear what James had to say. But I knew one thing: this was only the beginning. The silence in the room grew heavier, stretching out like a thick fog. James had said more than enough to shake my entire world, but he wasn't done. He hadn't told me everything, not yet, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the rest. But I had no choice. I had to know. Whatever this man knew, whatever he'd been holding on to, I needed to hear it. The truth was unraveling, and I couldn't turn away from it. I watched as he leaned back in his chair, his hands resting calmly in his lap. His posture was so relaxed, so completely at ease. It was maddening. Here he was, in my home, sitting across from me like he was some kind of guest, like he didn't just drop a bombshell that had torn apart everything I knew about my father. He had to know how much his words were affecting me, yet he didn't flinch. It was almost as though he was enjoying this, watching me squirm, waiting for me to demand more. And I hated that I felt so small in this moment. You think you know everything about your dad, don't you? James said quietly, his voice almost too calm for the storm that was brewing inside me. You think you've got him all figured out, that he's this upstanding man who worked hard and gave you everything. But there's more to the story than that, Adam. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. You don't know him, I snapped, though my words felt weak, unsure. You don't know what he's done for me, for this family. He's always been there. He's always been a good man. But even as I said the words, they didn't sound right. Something inside me was already starting to crack. James looked at me, his expression unreadable. A good man. Let me tell you something, Adam. Your father made a lot of money. He built his empire, yeah. But he did it on the backs of people like me. People he used. People he discarded when they were no longer useful. His words hit like a punch to the gut. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. What are you talking about? I managed to say, though my voice trembled. What are you saying? James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at me for a long moment, as if weighing whether or not to say more. The air between us seemed to thicken, the tension so palpable that it almost felt like the walls were closing in. I felt like I was suffocating, and I was desperate for him to just say what he knew. Your dad, James finally said, his voice low but steady. He wasn't always this successful businessman. He didn't get to where he is now by working harder than everyone else. He got there by cutting deals with people he shouldn't have, making promises he never intended to keep. He used me, Adam. He used me and then tossed me aside when I wasn't useful anymore. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was saying, but the words wouldn't connect. This couldn't be true. It just couldn't be. My dad had always been the rock of our family, the one who had provided, who had always been there. I couldn't reconcile this image of him with the one James was painting. But as I looked at James, I saw the sincerity in his eyes, the conviction in his voice. And it shook me. You're lying, I said, though my voice was weaker this time. My dad wouldn't do that. He wouldn't. Item. James interrupted, his voice cutting through my denial like a knife. You're in denial. I get it. I would be too if I were you. But the truth is, your dad made choices that hurt a lot of people. Me included. He left me with nothing. I lost everything because of him. My business, my house, my family. Gone. And he didn't even care. I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. James's words were like a crushing weight, and I struggled to keep my balance. How could this be true? How could my father, my hero, be capable of this? The man who had always been there for me, who had worked so hard to give me everything I ever needed, was he really that man? I thought back to all the times my dad had taught me about right and wrong, about honesty and integrity. All the lessons he had given me about making the right choices, about building something of value from the ground up. And now, here was this man, telling me that everything I thought I knew about my father was a lie. James leaned forward, his eyes intense now. You need to understand something, Adam. Your dad doesn't care about anyone but himself. He never did. And when you find out what he really did to me, to others, you're not going to look at him the same way again. I felt my stomach churn. It was like I had been punched in the gut, and every breath was harder to take than the last. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice cracking. What do you want from me? James paused, his gaze softening for just a moment. I'm not here to destroy your world, Adam, he said quietly. I'm here to give you the truth. You deserve to know who your father really is. I wanted to argue, to say that I didn't need to know, that I didn't want to hear it. But the truth was already there, swirling in the air between us, and I couldn't ignore it. The lies, the secrets, they were all coming to the surface now, and there was no turning back. How much of it is true? I whispered, almost to myself. How much of it is real? James's eyes darkened. It's all true, he said, his voice low and final. And you're gonna find out just how deep it goes. James's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and ominous. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I had to know more. I couldn't let it end like this, not with only half the story. I stood there frozen, trying to process everything he had said. My mind was racing, scrambling to make sense of it all. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had to ask, even if I was afraid of the answers. How? I finally forced the word out, my voice shaky. How did he? What did he do? James studied me for a moment, as though he were debating how much more to reveal. Then he sighed deeply, the sound heavy, almost like a resignation. It started with a deal, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight I wasn't ready for. A real estate deal. Back when your father was still getting started in the business. He came to me with an offer, promised me a partnership. Said we'd both make a fortune. We were going to build something big. But that was just the bait, Adam. The hook came later. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. Your dad used my ideas, my resources. He took everything I had and left me with nothing. He convinced me to sign contracts that would have made us both rich, but he changed the terms without telling me, using his influence to get me out of the picture. When I found out, it was too late. My business collapsed, and everything I'd worked for was gone. I was stunned, unable to speak for a moment. The idea that my father, the man I had always admired, could be capable of something like this was too much. I had always seen him as someone who had earned everything he had, someone who had worked hard to provide for our family. But now the picture I had of him was starting to shatter, piece by piece. What did he say when you confronted him? I asked, barely above a whisper. The words came out more like an accusation, but I couldn't help it. I needed to know. James's lips twisted into a grim smile. He denied it, of course. Said I was imagining things, that I'd misunderstood the terms. But he knew what he was doing. He knew exactly how to manipulate the system. And when it was all over, when everything had fallen apart for me, he just walked away, moved on like nothing happened. I could hear the bitterness in his voice now. The raw emotion that had been hidden beneath his calm demeanor before. It was clear that James had been carrying this anger for years. And now he was letting it spill out all at once. Why didn't you go public? Why didn't you tell everyone what happened? I asked, my mind still struggling to make sense of it all. Why let him get away with it? James looked down for a moment, his expression hardening. I tried. His voice tight. But your father has power, Adam. He had connections. Lawyers, investors, people who could bury the truth. And he made sure I couldn't get close enough to expose him. He destroyed me in every way he could and then erased any trace of the damage he'd done. I was quiet for a long time, absorbing everything James had just told me. The anger, the sense of betrayal, it was all there in his words. And I could feel it deep inside myself now, creeping up from some dark place I didn't know existed. I had spent my entire life idolizing my father, believing he was untouchable, but now I was starting to see the cracks in the image I had built of him. Why are you telling me all this? I asked, the question on the tip of my tongue for so long that it finally broke through. What do you want from me? Why bring all this up now? James's gaze softened, but only for a moment. Because you deserve to know the truth, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Because your father isn't the man you think he is. He's not the hero you've been raised to believe in, and you're going to need to face that sooner or later. The room felt colder now, the shadows stretching longer in the corners. The truth James had just revealed was a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. My father, the man I had trusted, had betrayed more than just me. He had destroyed lives for his own gain, and I was only beginning to understand the extent of it. I wanted to walk away, to escape from the crushing reality that was setting in. But I couldn't. I had to stay, had to know more. I had to understand why he'd done it. I had to know how far my father's lies went, and what it all meant for me, for our family. What else do I need to know? I asked, my voice almost breaking. What else is there? James looked at me, his expression unreadable. There's more, Adam, he said, his voice low. Lot more. And when you find out, you won't look at your father the same way again. My heart raced in my chest as I realized that everything I had known about my father, everything I had believed about my family, was crumbling. James wasn't just some stranger, he was a part of my father's past, a past that had been hidden from me, buried under layers of lies. And the truth was finally coming to light. I wasn't sure I was ready to face it, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stop now. James's words lingered in the air, filling the space between us like a thick fog. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my thoughts scattered, struggling to keep up with everything he had just laid bare. The truth he was revealing about my father was so much worse than anything I could have imagined. It was like a slow motion unraveling, everything I'd ever believed crashing down around me. I felt dizzy, my body tingling with disbelief. My father, the man who had always been my role model, my hero, had done this. Used people. Manipulated them for his own gain. And the worst part, he'd gotten away with it. He'd buried the past, hidden his mistakes, and no one, not even me, had known. Not until now. I still don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Why now after all this time? James leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine. Because Adam, he said, his voice steady. Your father's not the only one who's been hiding. You have a right to know what he did. But more importantly, you have a right to know the man he really is. His words stung, but I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. The need to know, to fully understand, consumed me. The idea of my father, the man I thought I knew so well, being a completely different person, someone I didn't recognize, was terrifying, but it was also a reality I couldn't deny. There's more. James continued, his voice low, almost reluctant. When your father made those deals, he didn't just hurt me. He ruined lives. Destroyed families. He used people to climb higher, and once he was at the top, he discarded them like they were nothing. I felt the weight of his words press down on me. Every breath was harder to take. I wanted to ask more questions, but the answer was always the same. More betrayal, more pain. How did it all end? I asked, my voice hoarse. How did he get away with it? Why didn't you stop him? James's gaze softened for a moment, and he looked down at the table, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his plate. I tried. Believe me, I tried, but when I came close to exposing him, he covered it up, had people shut me down, erased all the evidence. He made sure no one would believe me. He had too many connections, too many powerful people in his corner. I wanted to scream, to rage at the injustice of it all, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there numb, as the truth continued to wash over me. James wasn't the only victim here. My entire family, my life had been built on lies. I didn't know who to trust anymore. Why are you telling me all this now? I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. What's your endgame? What do you want from me? James stared at me for a long time, his eyes piercing. I don't want anything from you, Adam, he said quietly. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because you need to know the truth. Your father's not the man you think he is. And you deserve to see him for who he really is. You deserve to make your own choices about him, about your family. I'm not asking you to hate him. I'm just asking you to see him for what he is. His words cut deep, and I felt a chill creep down my spine. I had always thought my father was invincible, a man who had risen from nothing to build a life for us. But now, I realized how little I truly knew about him, about the choices he had made to get there. My whole life had been based on a foundation of lies, and I wasn't sure what to do with that knowledge. I stood up abruptly, my legs unsteady. I need to talk to him, I said, more to myself than to James. I need to hear it from him. James didn't stop me, didn't try to hold me back. You do that, he said softly. But know this, when you confront him, it won't be easy. He'll lie, try to make you believe it's all your fault, that you misunderstood. But the truth is right there, Adam. You just have to look. I didn't respond. I couldn't. There were no more words to say. I walked out of the room, my mind spinning, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I had just learned. I didn't know what I was walking into when I found my father, but I knew I had to face him. I had to confront the man who had raised me, the man I thought I knew, and ask him the questions I'd been too afraid to ask before. The hallway was quiet, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I could hear my mom in the kitchen, her voice low, probably talking to herself as she finished cleaning up. But I couldn't focus on that now. My thoughts were consumed with one thing: my father. I found him in his study, sitting at his desk as I knew I would. He was staring at a pile of paperwork, his back to me, oblivious to my presence. I paused for a moment, watching him, feeling the weight of this moment press down on me. This was it, the moment where everything changed. Dad, I said, my voice wavering. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine. And in that instant, I saw it, the fear in his eyes. The fear that had been hiding beneath the facade he had built for so many years. Adam, he said, his voice strained, as though he had been waiting for this moment, too. We need to talk. I didn't respond. I just stared at him, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. I stood in the doorway, my body rigid, my mind racing. My father, the man I had spent my entire life admiring, was sitting there in his chair, facing me. Looking as if the weight of the world had just landed on his shoulders. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear that I had never seen before. Dad, I said again, my voice barely a whisper, we need to talk. He didn't respond at first. Instead, he just stared at me, his hands clasped tightly together on the desk. The quiet between us was deafening, like the world had gone still. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning in the background, the soft rustle of papers. But it felt like there was nothing else in the room but the tension hanging between us. Finally, my dad let out a slow breath, a sigh that sounded too heavy for someone who had always been so confident, so in control. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine, as if he were trying to figure out where to begin. I never wanted you to find out like this, he said, his voice low and strained. I never wanted you to know the truth. I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't know if I was angry, hurt, or just completely numbed. The man who had raised me, who had taught me everything I knew, had been hiding a dark, twisted secret that I could never have imagined. I had been so blind. And now, everything was falling apart. You've lied to me, I said, my voice trembling despite myself. For my whole life. About everything. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever tell me what you did? My father's face hardened, but there was still that flicker of fear in his eyes, like he wasn't sure how to explain himself. For the first time, he looked small, vulnerable. I didn't want to ruin you, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I didn't want you to grow up hating me. I thought if I could protect you from the truth, you would be better off. But I see now that I was wrong. I shook my head, the anger bubbling up inside me. You think this was protecting me? You think keeping me in the dark was protecting me? I spent my whole life believing in you. Believing you were this perfect man, and now I find out it's all a lie. All of it. I never meant to hurt you, my father said, his voice trembling. But I did. And I can't change that. I can't undo what I've done. I could feel the anger rising in me, the injustice of it all, but beneath that there was something else, something deeper. Betrayal. A raw, aching betrayal that twisted in my chest. My father had built an empire on lies, on the backs of people like James, and he had done it all while I was watching, cheering him on, thinking he was the man I could always rely on. You took everything from him. I spat, my voice shaking with fury. You destroyed his life. You destroyed so many lives, and you never once thought about the people you were hurting, did you? You just kept going, kept lying. My father didn't answer right away. He looked away from me, his gaze falling to the desk in front of him, like he couldn't look me in the eye anymore. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but then he just sat there silent. I couldn't take it anymore. Why didn't you just tell me the truth? I demanded, my voice rising. Why didn't you just own up to what you did? Why did you have to hide everything from me? I couldn't. My father finally whispered, his voice cracking. I couldn't face the truth myself. I couldn't face what I'd become. And I sure as hell couldn't face you knowing the truth. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I could feel my chest tightening, the weight of everything James had told me settling in like a stone in my stomach. All the years of believing in my father, in trusting him, felt like they were slipping through my fingers, like sand being blown away in the wind. You destroyed my trust in you, I said quietly, the words coming out slower now, like they were being dragged out of me, and you don't get to fix that, not now, not after all this. My father looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret, filled with something I couldn't quite place. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said, his voice low and heavy. I don't expect you to ever see me the same way again. I don't even deserve that. But I need you to know something, Adam. I never wanted any of this. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I made a mistake. A big one. But I did it out of fear. Fear of losing everything. I didn't know what to say to that. There was nothing I could say. My father had built his life on lies, on manipulation. And it was impossible to reconcile that with the man I had grown up with. The man who had taught me everything I knew. The man I had trusted more than anyone. I stood there for a long time, staring at him, trying to figure out what to do. But in the end I knew there was nothing to fix. Nothing to say. The man I had known was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. And I didn't know if I could ever trust him again. I don't know what to do with any of this, I said, my voice barely audible. I don't know how to move forward. But I can't keep pretending. I can't keep living in the lie you've built. My father didn't respond. He just sat there, his head bowed, a broken man in front of me. I turned and walked out of the room, the weight of the truth pressing down on me with every step. As I walked down the hallway, I felt the heaviness of the past few hours crash down on me, and I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The man I had thought I knew, the father I had idolized was gone, and all that was left was the truth, the painful, ugly truth. I didn't know where to go from here, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't unsee what I had learned. I couldn't go back. And somehow, I had to learn how to live with that.